Next we have Maarten Boudry, is a philosopher of science. He has published over 50 academic papers and written multiple books on science and philosophy, the latest being The Betrayal of Enlightenment. Give a hand, please.
All right, welcome everyone. Wow, so beautiful and idyllic. Let me first talk a little bit about my expertise on food, which is almost non-existent. I was on the WePlanet podcast recently to talk about fossil fuels and climate change, where I do have some expertise. And Mark invited me to come over here to Helsinki and give a presentation at the conference. I warned him. I know almost nothing about food except how to jump it down and ingest it or digest it. But I do have some expertise about intuitive biases and misconceptions. My academic work deals with something called the epidemiology of pseudoscience or of false beliefs. So how misbeliefs spread in a population of human minds. So I'm going to talk a lot about the psychology of human food and what that tells us about the future of livestock and meat and the potential promise of the kinds of substitutes or alternative proteins that have been proposed here during this wonderful conference. So how evolved intuitions shape and distort our beliefs about foods? That won't work? It's just all right. Our minds have evolved, as you may have heard. Our brain is just an ordinary organ, just like the heart has been adapted for the function of pumping blood. The brain, of course, has a range of different functions. It's not really evolving to unravel the structure of the universe. So by and large, of course, you want to have an roughly approximate representation of reality, at least, and for ecologically relevant problems like steering clear of predators and telling apart edible from poisonous mushrooms. But sometimes the truth is maladaptive and people end up with misconceptions. A lot of these misconceptions arise from heuristics, so rules of thumb that our brain uses that are mostly, they're functional in the environments in which our ancestors evolved, but that can lead us astray in modern contexts. So our brain has evolved to solve the recurrent problems of survival and reproduction in an ancestral environment. Of course, that's the reason why it's much easier for people to develop an arachnophobia, a fear of spiders or of snakes, rather than cars or power sockets, even though these things are much more lethal today. But evolution hasn't had time to catch up with these developments. Intuitions about foods are also prevalent all across the world, of course, because food, we can be pretty sure, we don't know exactly what an ancestral environment looked like, but we can be pretty sure that we were eating food. Food has always been one of our major adaptive problems that we had to solve, how to find food that is safe and nutritious. So it's something that is very intimate and deeply ingrained. I'm going to give an example about GMO later on. I think perhaps apart from sex, which we're not going to discuss today, it's one of the most intimate things where the emotions are the most stubborn, I think, most resistant to scientific correction. Just to give you one example of what such an intuition, so deeply ingrained intuitions apply to food, but also to a range of other domains, look like. Essentialism. You may have heard of the term. Essentialism is the mental heuristic of dividing up the world into fixed categories, and the membership of an item to one of these categories derives from an invisible essence that is fixed and permanent. So this is something that children already develop very early on, so this is not something that you have to instill in them. If you have any children, of course, you know that they love just leafing through picture books and categorize different animals, even though not like all the different specimens are different in some respects. So of course there's individual differences, but they all belong to a certain category because they have the invisible essence of, for example, a zebra or a tiger. There's some psychological experiments about it. For example, if you show a kid a picture of little piglets that are wrapped in tiger fur and that are suckled by a tiger mom, and you ask the kids what will these little animals develop like, how will they behave if they grow up, will they start hunting down prey and growling like a tiger? Children already have an intuition without any need for education that these animals will still wallow in the mud and grunt just like pigs, because they have this invisible, ineradicable pig essence that is still inside of them, even though they look like tigers. The same with a walking stick. So even though it looks like a leaf, children will have the intuition that it behaves like an animal, that it will look for food, that it will reproduce, will try to avoid predators, etc. So this is essentialism in a nutshell. Now, if you start transgressing boundaries, so if you start from the belief that there are these invisible essences that grant identity to different categories in nature, then that encounters intuitive opposition. So both when it comes to beliefs about the structure of the world. So, for example, the picture that you're seeing here is taken from a creationist textbook, the infamous Croco Duck, something that they used to lampoon the idea that there can be intermediate forms between different kinds of animals. Of course, is an integral part of the idea of common ancestry. So, the root cause of creationism, of course, to some extent is biblical fundamentalism or just religious fundamentalism, but I think there are deeper cognitive reasons. Even for people who accept evolution, it is very hard to wrap your mind around the fact that we don't just have a common ancestors with apes and with monkeys, but also with pigs, with cucumbers, with any living with the organisms that that produce choline. So even these microorganisms, everything has a common ancestor, which of course implies that there are intermediate forms, the so-called missing links between different species. So that's just a misconception about nature, so something that makes us more resistant to accepting the idea of gradual, imperceptible changes that moves you from one category to the next. But it also has a moral dimension, and now we get closer to the food discussion. The resistance against GMO foods is part of it is, of course, propaganda from environmentalist organizations. But then, of course, a further question is, why is this propaganda so successful? Why does this appeal to people? And sometimes the people who haven't come up with imagery like that, to their own surprise, they just this went viral. This is really something that was incredibly successful in a way that they didn't predict beforehand. They just stumbled upon something that is just very deeply ingrained. The idea that if you insert something, if you violate the natural order by inserting a gene, for example, from a fish into a tomato, this is transgressing a boundary in a way that that is not acceptable. So it invokes purity concerns. Tampering with the natural order is seen as impure, and it also invokes disgust. And disgust, there's a lot of experiments on this, is one of the strongest emotions. And one of the hardest to correct or to override with rational or explicit arguments. Compared with insulin, I mean, you all know that insulin itself is nowadays, of course, produced by GMO technology. Somehow, this doesn't seem to bother anyone. So, but if it is something that we put inside our mouths, perhaps it's also because insulin is produced by a GMO organism. Or, I mean, you can have a range of different explanations. Perhaps people just did not catch on to the GMO origin until it was already well established, and then it's hard to dislodge this belief once you already know that it's safe. GMO is already consumed in the US, of course. So part of it is of course an accident of history. You can have the contingent development, but there is really an important cognitive dimension to it. So essentialism arises in a lot of different domains, but I think especially when it comes to food, it's exceptionally deeply ingrained. So many people have the intuition that when you insert the gene, and they associate the gene, of course, with this invisible essence, the thing that an organism derives its identity from, then this is just revolting and disgusting, something that we should not accept. More generally, of course, I don't want to use pretentious philosophical terminology, so I just erased the term naturalistic fallacy here, because it's in a way it's also a little bit misleading. But you're all familiar with this idea that whatever is natural is by definition good. This is not a well-defined theory. This is something that is more of an in-code sentiment. that is poorly defined, but it's also very deeply ingrained. So whatever is unnatural is seen as bad, as evil, as impure, as disgusting. So people might not have a very clear-cut idea of exactly what is natural. Is farming natural? I mean, in some respects, of course, it's extremely unnatural because it's all about genetic freaks, it's monocultures, it's very, very recent. In most of our evolutionary history, we have not had farming. But it's still, these divisions of natural and unnatural can be like developed in specific ways, but it always comes down to the same thing. Whatever is perceived or can be construed as natural is good, wholesome, healthy, beneficial, etc. Whatever is natural, unnatural is exactly the opposite. Now, in pre-modern societies, I mean, we have a common human nature, so these intuitions exist everywhere. But in pre-modern societies, hunter-gatherer societies, indigenous societies, these intuitions, I think, are held in check by reality. People have an everyday experience, not just of how nature can be good and wholesome and beneficial, but also dangerous. Predators, parasites, and pests, nature being red in tooth and claw, kind of like tempers our tendency to romanticize nature and to perceive nature as intrinsically good. I'm not sure if you can read the caption here of this cartoon. It's one of my favorites. Something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. In modern societies, on the other hand, exactly because we're alienated from nature, because we have been ensconced in all these modern comforts and luxuries, this tendency to romanticize nature, to believe that anything natural is good, is given almost completely free rein. And ironically, this tendency to romanticize nature is then projected backward onto the past or onto indigenous cultures. I mean, you often hear environmentalists say that we lost connection with nature, that we have to pay more attention or pay more heed to indigenous societies because they know still how, how to live in harmony with nature. Exactly, it's the other way around. It's exactly Westerners that are completely alienated from nature, that don't have to deal with these all the dangers and of nature, that tend to romanticize and tend to indulge in this naturalistic fallacy or equating the natural with the good. I could give you a whole range of examples, of course, of why the things that we consider as natural, even organic farming, are not natural, but I think this is just kicking in open doors for this audience. But I want to raise another question. Is it sometimes rational to be irrational? And this is something that was driven home to me when I read about an experiment. Some of you may be familiar with it. So in this experiment, people are given the choice between two different pieces of chocolate. One of them is shaped innocently enough in the form of a heart, and the other one is shaped like a cockroach. Now the one that is shaped like a cockroach is like 3 times larger. So you give people the choice between these two pieces of chocolate. What do they do? Surprisingly, a majority goes for the cockroach. But then afterwards, if you ask, after they have consumed the piece of chocolate, did you actually enjoy it? The large majority of them will admit, no, actually I didn't enjoy it, because of course it's a cockroach. How could I possibly have enjoyed it? What goes through these people's minds is when they're confronted with the choice, they're like, I know you're trying to trick me here, because obviously the cockroach is bigger, and you're trying to fool, like you're trying to trap me in, in this irrationality. I'm not going to fall for it. I'm going to go for the piece of chocolate that is larger. Now the question that I want to raise here in the context of this experiment is, who is being irrational here? Is it the person who is just revolted by the shape of the cockroach and goes for the little heart, or is it the person who, against his better judgment, goes for a piece of chocolate that he knows beforehand he's not going to enjoy, right? So if you know beforehand that, I mean, you have this irrational disgust that is evoked by a cockroach. Why would you put yourself through that ordeal? Why not just indulge in your irrationality and actually enjoy a piece of chocolate, even though it is smaller? I think that can be applied to a lot of cases of food neophobia. I mean, you all know what food neophobia is. There's a critical window in infancy through early toddlerhood where children are receptive to new flavors and foods. After 2 to 4 years, neophobia rises and the window narrows. In adulthood, it's very hard to, I mean, you're very unrepresentative, of course, because you're very adventurous and you're excited about anything that is new and even freakish. And so we have to keep that in mind. This is not representative of the population at large. But I have to admit, for example, the idea of eating an insect, even though I know rationally speaking that, I mean, it's an arthropod just in the same way that a prawn is, and I eat prawns. Like, why would I have any problem with eating spiders or bugs or even cockroaches? But still, I have to admit, I'm not going to enjoy it. So is it really irrational for me to say, no, I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna try out this new type of food? And because I have been thinking about food neophobia in this context and what really qualifies as irrational, I think I have become less judgmental of people who like organic farming. I have an organic market right next door, and I go there because it's convenient and it's close. But I also like to feel a connection to the land and have this idea that something comes out of the ground. And so I think I'm also indulging a little bit in this irrationality in a way that I didn't used to. So I had this idea that I know all these irrational tendencies have to be overridden. We have to stamp this out completely. But sometimes, I mean, if something is resistant to change, it's not wrong or it's not necessarily irrational to indulge in it a little bit. What we don't want, of course, is the kind of transgenerational cultural neophobia where you say, don't eat anything that your great-grandmother wouldn't have recognized as food. I mean, if we had followed this rule of thumb throughout human history, of course, we wouldn't have had even agriculture. Nothing would ever have changed. We wouldn't have had cheese or beer or anything like that. So that's, of course, something that we don't want. We want the next generation to be exposed because there is a critical window of time where you can expose children to new flavors or food. But it is not irrational per se for people, not to eat something that they just can't help to feel disgusted by. So should we judge people when it comes to organic farming? If it gives them good feelings, if they have a sense of emotional attachment, even though they know at some rational level that, of course, this is not what a farm looks like anymore. But even when it comes to predicting the future, I think the more affluent we will become, the more that we will be able to enjoy all these luxuries, we will become even more alienated from nature, and that is exactly what allows us to indulge in these fantasies. So I think this is going to get worse in some respects. Is it necessarily wrong? I'm not sure. This is an open question. I haven't really made up my mind about that. Organic farming is not natural, but is it wrong for people to indulge in these fantasies? At least some of the time. I mean, you can imagine a world where most of the bulk of our food is produced efficiently with very low impact, farm-free, so without any suffering, or clean and nutritious, etc. But then there's also a little niche that is still left over for people who want to indulge in some of these romantic fantasies. So what does this tell us about the future of livestock, future of meat and dairy products? Now, unfortunately, I know that the naturalistic fallacy is a fallacy, so we should not anything that is natural is good. But it is true that meat eating is natural, and no matter how you want to construe it, it's much more natural than farming because it's much more ancient. So humans are omnivores, facultative carnivores. Of course, we can survive without meat. We're not like obligate carnivores like felines. Not just eating meat, but eating cooked meat is natural. Some of you may be familiar with this book by Richard Wrangham, Catching Fire, where he's developing the hypothesis that the cooking of meat is exactly what even changed our anatomy, because we increased the nutritional value of the meat that we ingested, we could afford to shrink our jawbones, teeth, and gut size. So this cultural development, this cultural invention of the control of fire has actually even changed our anatomy. So eating meat and even cooked meat is natural. Sometimes I hear the notion that meat eating is part of the Western diet, and this is something that we're imposing on the rest of the world. I think we should not fool ourselves. This is something that is pretty much universal. Eating meat is the norm almost everywhere. Here you see some survey data. In many languages across the world, there's even a special word for meat hunger. So a specific craving for meat. So apart from just the general hunger or general desire for food. Meat consumption rises with GDP per capita. There's a very strong correlation. We can expect this to continue in the future. at least for the time being, and until we develop superior alternatives. But it's about the first thing that people do when they become affluent. They start to eat more meat. So in many developing countries, the most urgent and pressing issue is the lack of animal proteins in the form of meat and dairy products. Now, on the other hand, of course, there's a huge moral unease, especially in Western societies, where the circle of compassion is expanding, and there's a constant ratcheting up of moral standards. So there's a moral unease about the eating of animals. So if you ask people about their views on factory farming or even the killing of animals altogether, 49% agree with the statement, "I support a ban on the factory farming of animals." This is kind of shocking if you think about it, because there's not 49% of vegans in this society. So there is a little bit of a hypocrisy going on here. When the researchers first found out about this result, they couldn't really believe their eyes, and they asked another clarifying question to people: do you actually realize that when we ban slaughterhouses, there won't be any meat consumption anymore, because someone has to kill these animals if you still want to eat meat? Many of them just, stuck to their guns and insisted, no, we have to ban slaughterhouses. The word virtue signaling has already mentioned today. So, of course, it's easy for people to say that they want to ban slaughterhouses because they know that's not going to happen anyway, and they can flaunt their virtue without facing any consequences. But still, I think this moral unease is very much present, and to the extent that we develop superior alternatives to meat, it's not just about something that is achieves parity in terms of nutritional value, tastes, and price, but it will become better. Why would meat be the ultimate thing? Of course, we can actually exceed it. Then I think this moral unease will be sharpened and will erupt even more strongly and find a way out. And that might certainly disrupt the meat industry. So I think there's different forces that are battling with each other, sort of a tug of war between, on the one hand, this moral unease and also concerns with climate change and environmental issues, of course. And then on the other hand, this idea that meat eating is natural. I think we should not underestimate this. It's a very strong emotion, and neophobia is something that we can change over the course of one or several generations. But this idea that meat eating is natural will be very hard to eradicate. This I'm going to skip because this is all familiar to you about the land use and the environmental impact of meat. So the radical technologies that have been proposed here, precision fermentation and cultured meat, will they be successful? Is this really promising to disrupt the meat industry altogether? Actually, I should mention that a couple of days ago I gave a keynote for the meat industry, the Belgian meat industry. So I was in the lion's den in a way, and I was also talking about the future of meat. And what they were asking me is, does the meat industry still have a future? I mean, is it just a matter of time before alternatives will be developed, or the whole of society will turn against the killing and the husbanding of animals? One thing that we should keep in mind is that when it comes to these alternative products, that we can of course frame them as natural, as non-artificial, as unmodified, but I think it will be very hard to fool people, and we also have to be careful about not being disingenuous. I think, it's very hard to make predictions, but that the idea that the real meat, the authentic meat, the traditional meat, etc., is preferable because it is natural will be very hard to stamp out. I read a paper here about the perception of cultured meat among the population at large, and I was really struck by the final sentence of the abstract. It is important to explain cultured meat in a non-technical way that emphasizes the final product, not the production method, to increase acceptance of this novel food. So don't mention the production method, because if people look inside, the sausage factory, it's not a sausage factory, of course, then they will be appalled by the unnaturalness of it all. This is also something that was highlighted, and I asked a question about this yesterday during the presentation about the Soline. It is natural. I mean, it is even more natural than photosynthesis in some respects. So photosynthesis is the new kid on the block compared to, to this technology. It even existed before the invention of photosynthesis. If anything is natural, it's this. Okay, that's one strategy to try to convince people that it's unmodified, it doesn't contain GMO, it's not artificial, etc. But I'm afraid that it will not stick, that people will still perceive it as artificial and that it's still coming out of a vat. And also, we have to be careful about indirectly reinforcing the notion that whatever is artificial is bad. Because if you keep reassuring people that don't worry, it's not artificial, it's unmodified, it doesn't contain GMO, then of course you're suggesting that there's something very wrong with all these things that you're trying to avoid. I wanted to include a slide about Emma Maris. She wrote a wonderful essay, but I forgot it. We have to love nature and let it go, or something to that effect, where she's saying that she's envisaging a future where we have, where the bulk of our food is produced in a farm-free way, with cultured meat or precision fermentation in a way that is pain-free and not detrimental to the climate and to the environment. But she also sees a future where there will still be a niche of small-scale, inefficient or extensive forms of agriculture that is natural, just to allow people to enjoy this notion of having a close connection to the land. And I think in that context, livestock will probably continue to exist. I find it very hard to imagine that the meat industry would disappear completely, at least in the next couple of decades. I can imagine that it will be hugely disruptive. But I think, I mean, we can talk about this, that there will probably still be a future where meat and dairy products continue as a niche product. Where perhaps, because we are raising ethical standards and because people will be willing to pay a premium price for it, this bucolic fantasy that we now imagine, that's completely disconnected from reality, will be rendered real, will be brought to life in some respects. The future of livestock, the message I said to the meat industry is like, don't end up like Kodak. Perhaps in the next couple of years, a miracle would need to occur for precision fermentation or cultured meat to really achieve a breakthrough and really destroy at least a significant part of the market share of meat. But eventually it will happen, and they had better be prepared. And they were surprisingly receptive to that kind of information. They just want, they're very pragmatic. They just want to make a profit, and they're even interested in these kinds of novel technologies. I'm going to end up here because I think I'm running out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to have a coffee break, and